Hi, everyone. We'll be starting our webinar shortly. Welcome to our webinar. We'll be starting shortly. Okay, it looks like we got a fair amount of people go in here. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Heather Zemo, the Education Director at IAHSS. Our webinar today is titled The Birth of the Chief Security Officer in Healthcare, the Evolution, Impact, and Future of Healthcare Security Leadership. Before we get started, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping items. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself. There should be time at the end of our presentation for questions. I ask that you please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit your questions and not put them in the chat. They're a little they seem to get a little lost in there with all the chatter going in. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be available in the IAHSS store probably within the next few days. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Mike Hodges. Mike, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. And I'm excited for everybody to be here. I appreciate you taking the time. As Heather mentioned, we're going to talk today about the birth of the Healthcare Security Executive, whether the title is Chief Security Officer or Vice President or something else. This is a marked evolution in healthcare security as an industry, and I'm excited to talk about that because I can remember very clearly 16 years ago when I started a career in healthcare security, the idea of a chief security officer or a vice president was very few and far between. And so as we get into the topic today, I'm interested to talk about that evolution, the role that that position plays in healthcare and healthcare security. And more importantly, I want to talk today about what that means to all of us as leaders and really clarify that I believe this is more than just about a title shift. It's really more indicative of a transformational shift in our profession. So as we dive in today, we'll talk through that as we go. Just to share our learning objectives for the day, I'm hoping that we come out of this conversation with kind of 4 key things or points of understanding, where this came from, this evolutionary role, what has changed to kind of propel that role forward, why that role, the chief security officer or the healthcare security executive, why that role matters, and then how we prepare for it as leaders in the industry. And my hope is that this discussion helps you see where you fit into that evolution as well. I did want to start off by just sharing a little bit of my own story because I think it's important context for understanding what's led me here today to talk about this topic with you and why this topic is important to me. And I think my journey very much mirrors what's happening across our entire profession. I didn't certainly plan to be in healthcare security. I served in the United States Army from 2003 to 2010. I was a non-commissioned officer. I did combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I got out of the Army unexpectedly. I thought that the Army was going to be a career for me. But like many soldiers, I met a girl, and that changed kind of the trajectory of my life and the way that I thought about military service. And so as I got out of the Army, I had to figure out what I was going to do next. And I took a job as a night shift security officer in 2010. I had no intention on healthcare security being a career or looking for advancement of any kind. I just needed a job. And as I got into healthcare security, my expectations were very low. I thought, well, I'll probably be, checking IDs somewhere or, telling people to be quiet in the lobby. But as we all have learned at some point or another, when you get into healthcare security, it's a much different context than you anticipate. And in getting into that context and understanding healthcare security from a frontline perspective, I started to understand a lot of needs and opportunities and see a lot of opportunity in that field. I was promoted to department training coordinator in 2012 and then into supervisory roles in 2013. I was able to go back to school during this point, and I got a bachelor's degree in organizational leadership, which was a mashup between business administration and organizational psychology. I was then promoted to manager in 2016, and I was able to complete my master's program in executive leadership. And then I was promoted to director in 2018. In 2020, I obtained my CHPA and my CPP certifications. And then I became Piedmont's first system director in 2021, and then later was promoted to be Piedmont's first vice president of public safety in 2024. And so I think it's important to consider what has changed. It's not just about the opportunities that are available to us, but it was perspective and development throughout that process that I think really helped me in my advancement, but also mirrors what's happening in our industry. And I think, some of the things that are really important to me in the context of reflecting on my own story and how that works in the context of our conversation today is understanding that growth really does come from intentional investment development and not just experience. And so I think as we get into this conversation, it's going to be important to reflect upon that as we go. I want to take a little bit of moment, a little time here at the beginning to step back and look at kind of how we got to where we are today and how this CSO or healthcare executive role, security executive role evolved, because it didn't just appear overnight. It's been very much a slow development over time. And so as we look back, I kind of see four big picture phases that have at least been a part of my experience in healthcare security as a profession, but I think speak largely to the overall industry very effectively. And we start kind of in that foundational era where we're really more about kind of custodial efforts and enforcement based in the context of the work that we do. Everything in healthcare security from that perspective and at that time was more focused on the idea of physical presence and deterrence. We had limited integration with clinical or administrative operations, viewed very much as a support service, not as a strategic function in any capacity. And as we've grown over time, we moved kind of from that custodial and enforcement-based era more into a formalized safety and response program, where we started to see more growth in the complexity and structure of security programs. We've definitely seen an expansion in responsibilities. And while still largely reactive and functionally based in that era, more organized for sure, we've definitely seen that reflected in the growth and development of professional associations like the IHSS and the way that they approach the industry as well. And then we started moving more into what I like to call an integration era, where we started seeing more alignment with clinical and regulatory environments. So we became much more integrated into broader hospital operations in the organizations we serve. We've seen a lot of expanded scope in the last several years, where we get it more into patient safety support, more into workplace violence response, more into emergency management integration. All of those kinds of things have been key kind of programmatic drivers of integration into the larger and more broader hospital operations. And while still primarily operational, we definitely became much more increasingly cross-functional, meaning we got much more involved in a lot of the different aspects of our various organizations and how they function more broadly. And then most recently, we've really been diving into technology and risk expansion, really becoming more systems-based security programs. A lot of rapid growth in the security technology ecosystems. We're starting to see a lot more of our security programs becoming responsible for very large-scale capital investments, infrastructure management, and as our hospitals became larger and larger systems, seeing that expansion grow out across those systems with standardization of the technologies that we're integrating along with the programs that we've developed over the years. And then really moving more towards a shift to risk awareness, not yet potentially fully enterprise driven, but definitely more than just incident response, more related to risk identification. And so while we started as a very traditional kind of enforcement-based function, we've really become a much more structured, programmatic function based on the complexity of the healthcare environments we operate in. As those complexities have increased, the complexity of our programs have increased, and that's forced a lot of integration into the clinical and regulatory environments. And then technology and kind of that risk awareness has really driven a much larger scale expansion of those efforts, which has set the stage for, I think, where we are today in healthcare security's evolution. Yeah, each phase really kind of, as we've articulated them here, has increased the responsibility of our programs and has really driven more and more operational ownership, but not yet fully pushed us into that strategic authority that comes with that executive function. This has created a lot of change, and I think some of the key drivers that have really pushed the profession forward, all of those forces were kind of born out of that slow evolution. Violence in healthcare, challenges around behavioral health, regulatory pressures, the technologies and the complexity of those technologies, the growth of our healthcare systems, all of those pressures have really pushed us forward in an extremely meaningful and impactful way, but made the function of healthcare security far more relevant in the context of the strategic operations of our organizations. And that's been a key kind of driving component as we look at the birth of the chief security officer role. These were not, I think, optional changes. They were demands that were placed on healthcare. And as those demands became more and more relevant, we as security professionals were called upon to evolve to keep up with those changes and those demands. And that's really put us in a position where our leaders, whether we're at the manager level, the director level, or the executive level, we're increasingly expected in the security function to support patient care, resilience in the organization, the culture of the organization. It's much more than just an incident response programmatic function. So where does that put us today? So that brings us more to a strategic maturity phase, which I think we're in the midst of currently as a industry. Now we're starting to see a lot more enterprise risk alignment. These forces that are driving change have led us to kind of an inflection point in our industry. We're no longer just responding to incidents as they occur. We're also influencing how the organization postures itself for risk mitigation and prevention. And we've moved more from being a support services department to more of an enterprise capability. And I think we see that in kind of the way healthcare is beginning to recognize security as a contributor to that enterprise risk management process and to the building of organizational resilience. We're seeing more and more responsibilities expanded through our workplace violence prevention programs, behavioral health risk mitigation, system-wide preparedness planning. And we're seeing a lot more expectations of our leaders to evolve to be more data-driven in our decision-making and to be more effective in cross-functional coordination and working with all the various capacities within our organizations. So that influence is really starting to impact the overall organization in a much more strategic way. And I think that is the transition that is really marking this key change or sparking this key change to see more and more organizations develop a chief security officer role or a vice president of public safety or security or whatever that looks like in your organization. So why now, right? We have often pushed for growth in our own programs locally within our organizations. And we're definitely seeing safety more and more front and center as a strategic need within our organizations, whether it's related to workforce readiness and experience, the resiliency of the organization. All of those things are being treated more as enterprise level issues tied to key components of the organization, not just the physical security of our individual facilities. That shift is, I think, a real part of a broader recognition that security has to help shape strategy and manage enterprise risk and influence culture in a way that we've never been looked to help supplement before within our organizations. And that's a big opportunity for us. And I think it's really showing us as we look at kind of industry reporting and information that's being shared throughout the industry that we're seeing these roles being created to help align that strategy across facilities and across systems to really help in that transitional function. So I think the result there is we're seeing the chief security officer emerging not as a symbolic title, but as a response more to larger organizational complexities and accountabilities. It requires leadership, not just management. And it's more than just security as a function. The role is existing and being created because of the complexity and accountability that demand it. And I think that's extremely important for us to understand because it's not just a trend, it's really a structural shift in the way healthcare approaches security overall. We're seeing security leaders gaining a seat at the executive table to be a part of those larger strategic conversations, gaining responsibility for larger system-wide strategy and governance. And we're seeing expectations shift along with that emergence to really look for security leaders who can align security practice with organizational strategy and mission, help develop and lead enterprise risk mitigation efforts, manage those multi-million-dollar technology portfolios, and really tie what security does from a functional operational standpoint into larger patient-centered safety initiatives. And that's a big shift for us as an industry and a real opportunity for us as we continue to grow. So the question then becomes, what makes this role different from our traditional operational leadership models? When we think about the difference between a practitioner or an executive, or if we wanted to differentiate it as an operations leader versus a healthcare security executive, it's important for us to think more in terms of mindset versus scope. It's not just a change in the size of the scope of that individual's responsibility, but the mindset and how that individual approaches the challenges presented to the organization. When we deal with an operations leader, we're looking for a strong emphasis on technical expertise. And I think we've done a good job as an industry trying to build that technical expertise over time, trying to really grow the technical skill sets around physical security and systems integration in the way that we approach physical security in a healthcare setting. Lots of focus in the operations leader on incident response and management, patrol operations management, policy enforcement, that immediate tactical problem solving when issues present themselves, and the resource management and execution of the tasks assigned. When we start shifting to that executive mindset or moving towards that chief security officer role, technical expertise is still critical, but now we've got to supplement that with true leadership skill development. We start looking more towards, your capacities for strategic planning and organizational alignment, soft skills in the leadership category around executive presence and influence, how we align culture and lead culture in the context of security operations, how we leverage data and the capacity to make effective decisions in a proactive mindset, and then, of course, all the budget planning and capital planning and governance that comes with that. Ultimately, this is a leap for our profession, and we're being asked to make more and more large-scale strategic level decisions in the context of this shift. And we see, the differentiation being more about the operational leader ensuring that the program runs effectively, and the security executive ensuring that the organization is strategically protected today and for tomorrow. And that shift is a big deal in the context of how we look at that mindset shift across these two types of roles. So what does executive level responsibility really mean? And as I was kind of building this webinar presentation out, I probably could have spent 20 slides just going into this topic, just trying to dive into the various responsibilities. It means what we're trying to do is shift our thinking from that operational leadership mindset to think like an enterprise leader. And that means that we're understanding what are the bigger, larger strategic priorities of the organization, and how do we make our decisions for the security program match, supplement, and support those major system priorities. Based on our understanding of the organization's risk, the performance of our teams and the capabilities of our teams, and that long-term impact rather than the immediate impact of that tactical problem solving. It's a key responsibility that's hard to truly define when we start to think about the responsibility to shape institutional strategy. When we start contributing to conversations, we're thinking more about how we influence conversations in the context of relationships that we have no direct authority in. But due to having a seat at the table, we have the opportunity to contribute to system-wide planning in a way that really aligns our security initiatives with those organizational goals, helps us advocate for resources that we might not otherwise attain, and it really helps us shepherd and manage more effectively the growth and development of our respective departments. One of the things that I think is critically important in the context of executive level responsibility, and particularly as a leadership skill, is to cast vision and anticipate needs. One of the key responsibilities of an operational leader is to be immediately reactive to situations that occur. What we want to see in the transition to the executive level mindset is the capacity to anticipate needs before they occur, to clearly define kind of the future direction of the security program, and be proactive in the capacity to identify emerging risks and trends and needs for the organization before they become a reactive requirement. Another key kind of leadership skill in the context of executive level responsibility is to drive cultural alignment, to be able to, in the capacity of your leadership, influence behaviors and expectations that help align the function of the security organization to the mission, vision, values of the larger healthcare organization, to make sure that we're setting the tone to ensure safety and security within those contexts, and then grow those as shared responsibilities among our constituents within the organization, not just within the team that we lead directly. There's still that call to manage those complex technical portfolios as we get into larger and larger enterprise implementations of security technology, ensuring that we have systems that are standardized, effective, and aligned with our risk, our operations, our capital capabilities, and to be able to leverage those across organizations that span large geographic territories that may be cobbled together through different kinds of mergers and acquisitions, that may have historically much different mindsets across the industry and the way that we approach security as a function of the organization, and to be able to leverage all of those things and that understanding of cultural alignment to really help move towards effective system standardizations. And then also Leaders exist to build other leaders. And so we've got to be intentional in our responsibilities to build talent, to develop leaders at all levels by establishing kind of consistent opportunities for individuals to grow, to be mentored, and build succession plans that help support long-term organizational capability while seeing other individuals within our industry grow in their own responsibilities, capabilities, and skill. And then another kind of core responsibility that I think is a little more challenging to nail down, but it's the idea that we're responsible to contribute to thought leadership within the industry, to advance the profession by sharing our insights, by shaping best practices, by contributing to industry associations and being a part of that work as we try to leverage the opportunities we've been given in our own roles to help shape that understanding and opportunity across the larger industry. That's what it actually means to operate, I think, at this executive level. You're no longer just managing operations, you're shaping strategy, influencing culture, building capability, and thinking long term. And that's fundamentally different from the role that most of us were prepared for out of the gate, being that technical expert as a manager, director, or operational leader. And I think this really matters for our healthcare systems. At its core, this role connects everything. And we connect so many different aspects of our organizations, whether it's risk, it's safety, it's compliance, it's culture, it's strategy. We're tying together the way that patient experience interacts, or our guest services in your organization, how they interact with patients, all the way through how our nurses interact, how our officers interact. All of those things get tied together in the context of security and the way that we approach these things. It does fundamentally operate at a system level versus a local level. And it's what makes the position so valuable to healthcare organizations. We're aligning executive priorities with the operations of a security department locally to really impact risk management, regulatory readiness, patient and workforce safety, and organizational culture all in a unified way. And that really drives us towards being not only more secure as organizations, but consistently prepared and compliant and resilient in the way that we approach safety and security. I also think the emergence of this role is critically important to us as an industry, as healthcare security practitioners. It's a critical turning point for us. This is a moment where our profession is fundamentally changing in the way that it's viewed within the healthcare industry at large. We're moving from reactive operations to enterprise leadership. And that shift is really fundamental in changing how we approach healthcare security as an industry. The recognition that healthcare security programs are attaining through the implementation of roles like these in different organizations really helps us raise the level of visibility for healthcare security within the industry, and it signifies an elevation of our profession into that executive leadership function where we now have more direct influence over the strategy of the organization as it deals with safety and security. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us, and it's an opportunity we have to really seize in the context of how we move forward as an industry. I do think we have to be cognizant of that, critical turning point mindset in the way that we approach preparation for this, because I think it's preparation for a role like Chief Security Officer is critical in the context of how successful you can be in that role. I'm a big believer in leadership development. I think leadership development matters. I think it's always mattered. I think it certainly matters in this evolution. I am a little bit of a leadership nerd. I got both of my degrees in leadership theory. And so I think, I'm certainly I can get a little nerdy in this regard, but I think leadership development has always mattered. but certainly now. I think we've got to really take responsibility for preparing ourselves and preparing our teams for this evolution in the context of how we develop leaders. Um, this evolution has really evolved faster than our traditional training models have kept up with. We're moving again from that operational experience to more of that leadership development mindset. We're getting away from pure technical expertise and skill to the development of those soft leadership skills that matter in the context of that executive leadership table. And so operational experience alone is no longer true preparedness for executive level function. And so I think we've got to think about that in the context of how we approach our own leadership development and how we train others for leadership development in the context of leadership development. I think leaders have to translate security into enterprise risk, strategy, and value. And that becomes a skill all in its own right. How we teach ourselves and how we teach others to explain things related to security function in a way that can be understood through those risk, strategy, and value lenses is critically important. And I think without development, we put ourselves at a lot of risk. We end up misaligning with our executives' priorities, and there's gaps between how we deal with our program's effectiveness and how we deal with compliance issues across the board. And I think that's where many organizations and leaders struggle. We've got to significantly invest in how we communicate just as much as how we enact security functions. So, historically, while we've trained for technical and tactical excellence, now we've got to start building that leadership capability. And if we don't develop that, we introduce that risk that really puts us at a disadvantage. And leadership training helps us ensure that our capability keeps pace with the profession's growth. And that's really important for us as we go. So what are some of the core competencies of an executive leader? And these are capabilities that I think are really required at that executive level. So you would take these and add them to the technical skill that we already work to develop within the industry. But we've got to start, understanding executive leadership and thinking like senior leaders and being able to translate, security practice into strategic value, like we've already discussed. We've got to start building soft skills around executive presence and influence, learning how to communicate with clarity and credibility to help shape decisions that we don't have direct influence over. But because we now have that seat at the table, we've got an opportunity there through presence and influence to really shape decisions in a meaningful way. And learning that is a skill set that's very important. One competency that's critical is being able to navigate organizational dynamics, building relationships across that multidisciplinary spectrum where we can grow in credibility and understanding across the table from chief nursing officers and chief medical officers and chief operating officers. We've also got to build strategic planning skill sets. It's one thing to think about where we need to be in 5 years. It's another way to plan for that growth effectively and then execute on that strategic plan. So building strategic planning skill sets is critically important and is a core competency of that executive leadership level. We've got to build competencies around enterprise strategy and risk management, learning how to partner our security strategy with the management of larger risks and liabilities for the organizations we serve. We've got to do all of that with an understanding of the mission, vision, and culture of the organization, and allowing that to really be embedded in the work that we do, aligning the security function with that mission, vision, and culture in a way that really permeates every aspect of the day-to-day tasks that our officers engage in. We've got to build those data-driven operational mindsets where we're using analytics to guide decisions and improve outcomes and using those to tell the story of the work that we do each and every day. And then again, we've got to be keenly aware of the requirement to build talent. building our strong teams through coaching, through training, through succession planning, through mentorship opportunities. These are key components of the work that we do. So like I said, leaders I don't think are accidental. I think they are developed over time. They're built through structure, through exposure, and through experience. And it takes time and it does require intention. So I think we've got to, as an industry, start considering what structured leadership programs or formal training pathways are we engaging in as leaders? And then what structured leadership programs and formal training pathways are we building for the teams that we lead? How are we allowing individuals to grow in leadership skill and development and not just technical expertise and physical security skill? One of the things that's been important in my career, and I think is important to a lot of us, is that progressive roles build scope, responsibility, and exposure. My first opportunity as a new security officer was to move into that training coordinator role. I'm a big believer that training is a great stepping stone into leadership. You've got to be a good teacher in a lot of ways to be a good leader. And I think that, that opportunity was critical for me. But moving progressively through that role into supervision, becoming a manager, then a director, then getting system-wide, responsibility in the context of my leadership roles, all of those things built exposure over time for me and helped grow my own experience. It's a long way from being a crusty Army sergeant to being a vice president in a large healthcare system. And some of those rough edges had to be smoothed off through time and exposure and experience. I think those are key and important in the context of how we mentor and grow individuals in our own teams. One of the things that's key in the development of effective leaders is building that cross-functional experience and understanding. We've got to build experience in the way clinical operations work within our organizations. We've got to understand and be able to put ourselves in the shoes of nurses and physicians and guest services representatives and facilities team members, et cetera. We've got to be able to put ourselves in those shoes and build experience that allows us to do that effectively as we understand those different functions of the organization so that we can speak more credibly in the opportunities that we have to shape that organizational strategy. I also am a big believer in professional certification and advanced education. Obviously, I pursued a master's degree, so I'm a big believer in advanced education, but I think professional certification is just as important, especially as you're building that technical skill set, that physical security skill set. And I think helping push and propagate that in the context of our own leadership development programs is really important to build the credibility of the officers that we are leading and to help them position themselves well for growth and development over time. And then you cannot underestimate the impact of mentorship and coaching over time. I've been very blessed and fortunate to have worked for some very exceptional leaders who took the time and interest in me to give me that mentorship and coaching to help me smooth off some of those rough edges. And I think that's incredibly important, as I have benefited from that, to be able to do that for others. And I think we've got to, whether formally or informally, leverage mentorship and coaching opportunities to help grow leaders in our own organizations. And then I think we've got to define, you've got to look for continuous development that's tied to evolving responsibility. Responsibility is a cornerstone to leadership, and in the context of responsibility, we develop an understanding of that more effectively through continuous development opportunities and stretch assignments, opportunities to take on more responsibility and grow. And so I think that's a key opportunity for us. It takes time, it requires intention, but leaders can be developed, and we have to put the investment into that to prepare ourselves effectively. I think this is very important to sustaining our profession's future. It's bigger than any one of us. It's bigger than any one position or job. We have to build pipelines and grow effective leaders in order to take on these responsibilities as we see this evolution continue in healthcare security. And the profession only advances if we are engaged in that development process. If we're intentional about developing leadership pipelines, if we're intentional about building leadership councils and training programs and competency models, if we're intentional about succession planning and the structure surrounding that, and then really looking at not just the hard technical skill, but the soft skills associated with leadership, where we build skills around influencing without direct authority, driving system-wide change, and being able to truly view security from that strategic mindset, and then leading across multiple facilities and with multiple stakeholders across the multidisciplinary function that is healthcare. Ultimately, I think we own this moment. As security practitioners across the industry, this moment is not just about the emergence of a new role in the healthcare security career track. It's really about the elevation of the entire profession. We're being given influence and visibility and responsibility in a new way, and each of us has a responsibility to engage in that effectively. The future of healthcare security will really be defined by those who step forward and lead and influence and align with organizational strategy in a way that's going to be truly effective and bring true value to our organizations. And we have to invest in our own development. We have to invest in building the next generation of leaders. And we have to really elevate the standards of our profession in a way that truly helps us own this moment well. It depends on what we do with it, where we go from here. And that's what really gets me excited about the opportunities that we're seeing develop in healthcare security. So hopefully this was helpful to you in some meaningful way. I definitely appreciate your time and engagement. I'm happy to answer questions. As Heather mentioned, we've got a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there, and I see we've already got a couple of questions that have been submitted, so I'll try to answer those, and then if you have questions, please submit them. But the first question that I see is, what does the structure look like below a CSO, e.g. directors, managers, officers? What do dotted lines look like? That's a great question. That's going to be a little different from organization to organization. I think, in my experience at Piedmont, I was the first system director and then the first vice president of public safety, and we'd never done it before. So we really had to kind of figure out what makes the most sense in the context of how those lines look. I think what's most effective is, for that, depending on the size of your organization, for that executive to have a direct line to the director level, whether it's regional directors for large systems or individual facility directors, and then those managers and officers kind of falling a little further down the reporting structure underneath those directors. And so they're keeping that span of control as manageable as possible in the context of how we execute the function. Looks like another question we've got here is, what challenges have you run into with executive leadership and presenting this once you have the companies built and are ready to present? That's an interesting question. So I think, anytime there's a push for a new position like chief security officer or vice president of public safety or whatever that might look like, there's always going to be the organizational pushback about the resource investment that's required and what's the true need. And I think you have to tie any kind of push for a position like this to risk mitigation and to those drivers that we talked about, as we talked about some of the pressures that we've seen in healthcare around, violence mitigation and, emergency management strategy and organizational resilience and workforce safety and all those things kind of tied together, really being able to present the value of the proposal and the proposition. Because most of the kind of pushback that you end up getting is, and the challenges you end up getting is, man, this is a costly investment. And what do we get out of this? And so being able to articulate that return on investment and how it positions the organization to be more proactive in risk mitigation versus reactive, how we end up mitigating larger issues along those lines, I think really helps sell the opportunity more effectively. Let's see, another question that just came through. Who does the chief security officer typically report to, e.g. CEO, COO, etc.? Is this one value to having a CSO is to elevate the position and department to report directly to the C-suite? I think the value is to have that individual being more a part of the C-suite as opposed to reporting directly to the C-suite. My hope would be that even at the facility level, your director of security or public safety or whatever the title is for that operational leader, they're already reporting at least to a local executive. I would see it more closely aligned to the COO level role. But for a chief security officer or vice president of public safety or whatever that executive title might be, one of the things that I think is critically important is that person has a seat at the same table as the COO. And so, depending on the structure of your organization, if you have a large system, having a direct reporting relationship into one of the senior system executives, I think makes the most sense. Or if this is at a more local function or a smaller level, having a direct reporting relationship into the CEO or maybe the chief risk officer or something along those lines. Another question just came in: as healthcare organizations move towards risk-based security program, how important do you see identifying governance for employees, contractors, and visitors in reducing operational risk? Where do you see the gaps, if any? That's a great question. So as you think more about enterprise risk mitigation or risk management strategy, you're definitely looking more at governance than you are at anything else. And so how does the organization govern those risks and use that governance effectively to mitigate? And that is going to have a trickle-down effect, not only for employees, but for anybody that comes into your organization, whether it's your contractors, your visitors, et cetera. And so that's where we get into kind of the competencies around building governance structure versus building, tactical response. And so as we think about kind of how we're shaping policy, how that policy is being implemented, and all the governance components in between, I think that is critically important in the function of a chief security officer in how we identify risk and then mitigate that risk through those governance structures. And I think that goes all the way down. I think there are a lot of gaps in healthcare across the board when it comes to how effective we are at implementing effective governance strategy and then mitigating risk effectively through it. So I think there's definitely some gaps there, but that's a great question. Let's see, we've got another question that popped up. What barriers are getting in the way for CSOs relative to executing their vision and strategies? And do you envision that increasing frontline officer compensation to a career sustaining level being necessary to match expectations and increasing responsibilities? Yes. The barriers are going to be the same more than anything else. My hope is that as we see more titles like this evolve, more positions like this become implemented in different organizations, we have an opportunity to address those barriers more directly and more effectively. The barriers are always going to be the push and pull between resource capability and resource allocation. Like what do we need? Whether it's financial compensation associated with our frontline officer staffing, whether it's, the capital investment needed for technology, implementations, whatever those kind of resource requests are, there's always going to be barriers and push and pull surrounding those around how, you know, what we allocate to the security function and what we allocate to the clinical care function. And that push and pull, I don't think ever goes away, no matter what level um, the executive resides at. And so the challenge then becomes, how do we align our, vision and strategies with the organization's vision and strategies in such a way that helps mitigate some of those barriers and get us the resources that we need to move that vision and strategy forward. I do think that in increasing frontline officer compensation is going to be critically important to the sustainment of the industry long term, and that's definitely going to be a big opportunity for us. The next question is, by chance, do you have a document, white paper, or executive recommendation that supports elevating the chief security officer role within healthcare organizations? If you're able to share, or is this something that for IHSS to move forward? I think there's opportunity for IHSS to engage here in a meaningful way to help kind of shepherd the way that the industry approaches this. Whether it's, building more formal leadership training programs for that chief security officer level, or, moving towards, producing the white papers and kind of thought leadership documents that would help support it. I do think there's a couple of good articles that have been put out related to this. My email's up on the slide. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to try to share those with you directly. I'd have to pull them back up to find them for you. Next question is, what are your thoughts on the FASCI program and aligning with healthcare executives? I think that's a great idea. It's a huge investment to move towards that. For those that aren't aware, it's like a fellow of the Association of, Clinical Healthcare Executives or something like that. I can't remember the exact acronym, but FASCI's been a major kind of certification for healthcare executives for a long time. It's like a mark of excellence in that C-suite level for healthcare executives. And I think that trying to dive into those and align with those really helps, because it gives a lot of credibility to that function. Got another question here. Run a corporate security advisors, a firm of former Fortune 500 CSOs who now help healthcare security leaders build their organizations into CSO-led functions. The biggest gap we see is that security leaders don't fully understand what is possible. How do we help more security leaders understand one of the keys to building their organizations and unlocking millions in funding for their programs is to learn to build a proper strategy and business plan, unlocking those resources? I 100% agree with you there. I think one of the things that I love to do more than anything else is in kind of mentorship with younger security professionals who are looking to move into leadership roles and are thinking about career advancement. One of my primary advices is, especially if they're going back to school, is not to get a criminal justice degree or a security management degree program, but to get a business program. That's a language that we have to learn to speak well. We've got to be able to build, understand organizational strategy and build effective strategic plans and business plans, and be able to communicate at that level, especially at the C-suite. And that's a core competency for sure for the chief security officer function. I think it's absolutely important for us to build that skill set more effectively, and being able to communicate like at the business administration level is really a challenge for us in the security space. Let's see, what do you see as the biggest security and safety challenging facing healthcare organizations over the next 3 to 5 years, and how should healthcare security leaders prepare for it? Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to see in the context of healthcare security kind of writ large is more our capacity to build organizational resilience around disaster preparedness and management. We're continuing to see large scale disasters impact more and more locations across the United States in particular. And I think we have a huge gap in healthcare around building that resiliency and positioning our security programs to manage incidents in a very effective way. But I think that is also kind of part and parcel of that larger leadership development gap. We've got to really close that leadership development gap in a way that's going to help prepare all of our officers, whether it's a frontline security officer all the way up to that chief security officer level, for the leadership requirement associated with all manner of risk. Let's see, where do you see the biggest opportunities to improve situational awareness, operational efficiency, or campus safety outcomes, and what obstacles are preventing progress today? Oh man, you guys are throwing the hard ones. I like it. Biggest opportunities to improve situational awareness, I think, relates directly to our capacity to implement effective technology systems. We have a lot of opportunity related to how we engage, organizational functions like security operations centers or real-time information and crime centers, those kinds of functions that we see more and more relevant in the law enforcement or policing space, but not effectively utilized in the context of our not quite the effectively implemented in the context of a healthcare security program. And I think building that technological situational awareness is critical. And I think that has the trickle down effect to improve operational efficiency and campus safety outcomes. And I think the obstacles there are understanding around what those things do, how that technology works for us, and then also the gaps in how we actually implement that technology well and build the skill sets to use that technology well, so it does enable our security function more effectively. Let's see, what size of an organization, in your opinion, warrants this position? Oh, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of different answers to that question. So you asked for mine, I'll give it to the best of my ability. I think you have to have a true system level organization. What I mean by that is multiple hospitals working under a central unified kind of executive governance system. And so I think you've got to have a larger organization to really warrant that executive level position, and that's going to look like 3 to 5 to however many more large hospitals, physician practices, outpatient clinics, et cetera, kind of multiple facilities operating in a single organization under a unified system level governance structure. Where do you see the role of AI in the CSO position? Well, I think AI has a critical role to play in security across the board. I think I mentioned the gap earlier around how we implement and utilize security technology in the context of like operations centers and real-time crime centers. I think it's going to play a critical role there. But I also think part of the function of the chief security officer role is to be able to identify how that technology, whether it's AI or whatever emergent technology we're evaluating, how that plays a role, and be able to speak to that effectively in order to leverage that. That's part of that kind of vision casting and anticipating needs thought process in the chief security officer function. Well, I know we are up against time. I am very grateful for your questions and your engagement. My email is up on the slide, so happy to try to respond to any questions that you may have beyond this, but thank you for your time. And I've really enjoyed being able to talk through this with you. So thank you all.
Thank you, Mike. Great presentation. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining.